So I like to start our programs just by framing a little bit the work that we do. Our mission is to document Jewish women's stories, elevate their voices, and inspire them to be agents of change. And as Jewish educators wearing the many different hats that you are all wearing today, you're sort of essential partners in that work. You're the people who are on the ground, making this happen. You are the people who know your students and what their needs are and can take the material that we have and sort of run with it. And through your work, you're catalysts for bringing rich, inclusive history and sort of a more complete story of the Jewish people in America to your students. And we absolutely couldn't do that without you. So I just want to thank you for that and also say that we are your partners in that work. Our job is to support you. And we do that in many different ways, whether it's through professional development program, or if you have questions, you can shoot us an email or give us a call. And our job is to help you make that happen. And together, what we're sort of our framework for thinking about how education happens is using history as a way for students to open up a study of themselves and their own identity. So taking historical role models, historical stories, and asking some questions about who are these people? Why did they do what they do? What about their experience makes them who they are? And then being able to use that as an entry point and a jumping off point for thinking about who I am as a student, who I want to be when I grow up, or who I want to be tomorrow when I walk out of my house, and what impact I want to have on the world, and doing all of that through a Jewish lens. And a lens that sort of speaks to their experience, not just as Jews, but as American Jews. There's something unique there about that. So try to sort of put all of this in the context of that theory of how we are connecting students to this history in order to help them live their lives in a Jewish way and in a socially active way. So also, just to be transparent, these are the goals that I sort of set out for this program. So I want to give you some historical background that will arm you with information about the events and people that we're talking about so that you can speak more eloquently about that and feel a little bit more prepared. And of course, there's lots of additional resources that you can do your own research. And also specifically, as we do the document studies and the activities, trying to build this connection between how Jewish experience and values informs action. So how does who we are and what our lives have been like inform what we do in the world and what drives us? And lastly, we'll be modeling a couple of different keys and introducing you to some texts so that you can take them and turn around and use them pretty much immediately in your classroom or in your community or on your service learning trip. So I want to start by asking you all what you know already about Freedom Summer, if anything. So feel free to unmute and type in the chat and just let us know what you know. And it may be that you don't know anything. That's totally fine. That's why you're here. Yep. So people are saying not much. I think it was in 1964. Wow. Okay. So attending the memorial service in Neshoba County for Cheney, Schwerner, and Goodman. So something about their murder being associated with Freedom Summer, absolutely. It was a group of college students who went to Mississippi to help with voter registration and set up schools. Yep, totally. It was a movement organized for voter registration and education in Mississippi. So yeah, that word movement is really important also. Great, all of this is right. So just to give you some historical context, this is a very limited timeline of the civil rights movement. I'm reading a book right now about Freedom Summer, actually, and it starts like in the 1800s. So this is only a small snapshot of that. But Freedom Summer did happen in 1964, right before the Voting Rights Act, after all of these sort of examples of nonviolent direct action that we saw, with sit-ins and boycotts and the freedom rides. So it's Freedom Summer happens at a point where the civil rights movement has been gaining a lot of steam. Organizations have been growing. And it was a project that was specifically based in Mississippi that was spearheaded by two organizations. One was COFO, the Council of Federated Organizations, that was an umbrella group that included Mississippi members of the NAACP, the SCLC, the Southern Christian Leadership Conference, of which Martin Luther King was the sort of founder, and was a church-based group. CORE, the Congress of Racial Equality, which did collected a lot of affidavits about violence against African Americans, and also did voter registration work, and the Student Nonviolent Coordinating Committee. And so those two groups together, COFO on the Mississippi level and SNCC, the Student Nonviolent Coordinating Committee on a national level, really targeted Mississippi. And that was for a lot of different reasons that we'll talk about in a second. And so the volunteers who came south during Freedom Summer, there were about 1,000 students from the north, some Black and some white. Though the majority were white, they were affluent. Many of them were college students, and college students going to places like Harvard, Cornell, those sort of big name places, other places too, but especially those schools. And estimates say that probably about half of the white volunteers that came south during Freedom Summer were Jewish, even though Jews only made up less than 1% of the US population at that time. I think that statistic is really interesting. It was really powerful to me when I first heard it, to think like, wow, Jews are grossly overrepresented in this group. Why is that? And I think that's where there's an interesting point when we're talking about this with students of all ages, whether it's adults or teens or middle school students, thinking about what is it about Judaism, about American Judaism, and about American Jewish culture that drives young Jews, or drove young Jews in this case, to participate in social justice work. And so before they went to Mississippi, volunteers would stop in Oxford, Ohio, and they would participate in a few weeks of training. And that would introduce them sort of to the racial dynamics of their work. It would give them some background in nonviolent responses to different experiences that they might have, and was sort of a filter to make sure that the people who got to Mississippi were people that could really handle doing work. And the reason that Mississippi was targeted is because 42% of the state's population was Black, but less than 5% were able to vote. And there were a lot of restrictive laws about both real laws and sort of de facto practices in Mississippi that discouraged Blacks from voting. So there was a literacy test. You were required to interpret part of the state constitution. That you had to pay special poll taxes in a lot of cases. And on top of that, there was physical intimidation. There was a chance of sort of financial retaliation if you were a business owner. When you registered to vote, the records for that were released, and people in the community would come and target your business. They might boycott you. It was very risky and very dangerous in many different aspects to register to vote and to sort of work towards your enfranchisement. But the history of voter registration efforts and working for representation in Mississippi is quite deep and rich. And what was started by regional groups and then was picked up by the NAACP and then by CORE really grew and grew and grew. And so when SNCC said, hey, we can send these people down, it really catalyzed a lot of change happening at once. And that work was happening sort of in 3 different areas, which you all mentioned. So one is working in freedom schools, teaching about everything from literacy, Black literature, math, science, politics, and that was in general to the public, to kids, to young adults. There was a lot of voter education, canvassing to register voters, getting people to pledge, escorting them to the registrar's office, and then dealing with any of the repercussions of that. There was a lot of distributing of money and support to make sure that risk was minimized for people who were working to vote, to cast their vote, I should say. And then there was also the creation of the Mississippi Freedom Democratic Party. So this grew out of a project that had happened before where they had cast a freedom ballot. So African Americans had made up their own party and said, listen, it's not that Blacks don't want to vote, they do. And so they created this party and this initiative to elect representatives to demonstrate that they did want those rights, that what whites were saying in the South wasn't true, and that there was actually a problem with the system. And so in 1964, they created the Mississippi Freedom Democratic Party with over 60,000 people signed up as members of the party. They elected delegates, they held caucuses, they had assemblies, they had a statewide convention, and then they sent a delegation to the National Democratic Convention. And unfortunately, their party wasn't recognized at the Democratic Convention. The delegates weren't given a place in the delegation from Mississippi, though Lyndon B. Johnson did sort of give them 2 token seats. He wasn't really willing to go the whole way and say, yeah, there can be Black people on the Mississippi delegation, because several Democrats from southern states threatened to sort of pull their support and leave the party. And so that was too risky for him. And that actually caused a lot of disillusionment within the movement and sort of fueled this feeling that happened in 1964, 1965 that ended up leading to a lot of other movements, including the Black Power movement, coming out of what had until then been a movement pretty focused on nonviolence and economic action. So it's interesting how this project in this one state was sort of a petri dish for all of the problems that were happening with racist issues and policies at this sort of turning point in our history. Does anyone have any questions about that before I go on? Great. So I just want to say a few things about sort of the outcomes of this effort. So the project created more than 40 freedom schools, some of which became sort of enduring institutions and continued to live on as schools or community centers. And like I said before, 60,000 African Americans signed up to join the Mississippi Freedom Democratic Party. And also, a lot of the activists from the North who came and were active in Freedom Summer, sort of this was where they cut their teeth in activism, and they went on to be activists in the feminist movement, in movements for Soviet Jewry, in the LGBTQ movement, and other civil rights and social justice movements and issues beyond that. So this was really a place where those people first connected with that motivation to work on behalf of social justice and continued it for the rest of their lives. Great. So what I want to do now is, I'm glad I clicked this. I just did want to mention one other thing that you all brought up, Goodman, Cheney, and Schwerner. So in June of 1964, so at the beginning of the summer, these 3 men were kidnapped and then murdered while they were investigating the burning of a church in retaliation for the church partaking in voter registration efforts. And both Andrew Goodman and Mickey Schwerner were young Jewish men, as was Mickey's wife, Rita Schwerner. She was a Jewish woman, I guess I should say, but she was also Jewish. And I'm just putting a quote up here. I'm not going to read it, but this quote from Rita Schwerner, I think, really emphasizes and encapsulates one reason that many, many Jewish activists cite for going south, which is we went south because there was something wrong, and because we're white, people noticed. And that was a huge tactic throughout the civil rights movement, but especially in Freedom Summer, was if we involve young white people, the rest of the nation will take notice and things will start to change. So that was certainly like a tactic of the movement and something that everybody understood. So a few words about this lesson, and feel free to interrupt or raise your hand or type in questions at any time. Yeah. So a few words about this lesson. This is a role playing lesson. So in the lesson plan, we ask students to sort of imagine that they're in Oxford, Ohio, and they're getting ready to go south. They learn that Goodman, Cheney, and Schwerner have just disappeared and are probably dead. And through different activities in the role play, they're asked to consider three main questions, which is in character, why are they here? Why are they considering being volunteers in Freedom Summer? What is motivating them to go or not to go? So why is it important, or why might they not go? And then based on what they're good at, which projects might they want to participate in? So those are sort of the three questions that we come back to periodically throughout the lesson plan. And I will say one other thing about this lesson plan, which is that it's long. I mean, I'm giving you a very, very abridged version of it today. So it lends itself really well to, if you have volunteers or teen teaching assistants or madrichim, they can run some of these stations. You can also break it up over a few different lessons, or you can decide, like, I'm only going to do this part of the round robin and the concluding activity. And we created Living the Legacy and the lessons within it, so that you can sort of pick and choose what's going to work best for your community. So the first station is actually a four corners game, which it's hard for us to do because we're all sitting at our computers, but we're going to try to do it virtually now. So what I'm going to do is I'm going to share a whiteboard with you all. And you'll see here on the whiteboard, there are four corners with a statement in each corner. And what I would like you to do is I think I'm making it so that you can write. So in the top left corner, there should be a text button. So see if you can locate that. And what you're going to do is you're going to put your name in one of these four corners. Let me know if for some reason that isn't working. You can't edit. Okay, so what you should do then is what I'm going to do is I'm going to put a number in each of these. Yeah, exactly. So I'm going to put a number in each of these quadrants, and I want you to tell us which quadrant you would put yourself in terms of why you would go south during Freedom Summer. Which of these things do you think was the motivator for young Jews? Just take a minute to look at them. And I should say there are no right or wrong answers. Great. And also be sure to notice other people. So we've got a few people in 2, a few people in 3, someone saying sort of between 1 and 3. And does anyone just want to sort of speak up and say anything more about, if there's anything more about sort of why you chose where you chose? Feel free to type that in. So between 1 and 2. And so obviously, if you were doing this with your students, you could put these up around the classroom and have students go stand next to the sign that most represented sort of their perspective. So yeah, definitely. I just want to recap some of these things. So historically, Jews were not considered insiders at all, and that's certainly true, especially in the South. A lot of Southern Jews at this point in history really felt like they had just earned their status as whites, and many of them didn't really even feel like they were white, so they were really outside. And also that Jews as an immigrant population to the United States, or always sort of carried this outsider piece with them, this part of the identity. Yeah, and so also this piece about social justice always being important. We have a biblical imperative for that. We also have sort of a historical imperative that's related to the Holocaust, right, of never again, and thinking about that. So certainly, Rachel, I think you raise a good point that these issues are somewhat connected also, that none of them are happening in isolation. Great. So so now what we're going to do is we're going to actually get a chance to read a little bit about, or some text from actual volunteers in Freedom Summer. So I'm going to hide this for a minute. So Miriam has volunteered to read a couple of quotes for us that we're going to sort of use as a basis for discussion. So, and I should just say, this is from Vicki Gabriner, who was originally from Flatbush, New York, went to Cornell, and came south to work in Tennessee over many summers, including 1964.
One of the strong things I grew up with as a kid was some sense of fighting for social justice, and without realizing it, that was rooted somehow in Jewish tradition. It was never specifically identified to me as such, and I don't even know that was what was driving people. But as I look back on it now, I know that was part of that Jewish secular tradition of social justice.
So this definitely echoes the piece that a few of you mentioned about there being something about Judaism that is connected to social justice. And for a lot of people, social justice is the secular sort of expression of Judaism. Yeah, and the secular tradition in Judaism is something that we don't teach about very often, especially if we're not working in a secular education setting, but something that's really interesting, very connected to social justice movements in the US, and we have a lot of information about. Okay, and this is from Heather Booth, who worked in a few places in Mississippi, and we actually have another lesson about her in our Go and Learn collection. So,
I grew up in a family that had good social values, reflected in our Jewish heritage, culture, and history. When I was growing up, at one point I wanted to be a rabbi, but was told at that time women couldn't be rabbis. I went to Israel when I graduated from high school in 1963, and the experience of Yad Vashem, the Holocaust Museum, had a transforming effect on me. I promised myself that in the face of injustice, I would struggle for justice.
Great, thank you.
My pleasure.
So, we have the students look at these two texts and then answer some questions. So I want to we're not going to answer all of them. I want you to see what the options are, but I would love if people can just sort of pinpoint what values or experiences were motivating or influential for either Vicki Gabriner or Heather Booth. There were a few different things we can call out, and I'll just sort of toggle back and forth between the two texts so that you can revisit them. I see. Yeah. So social justice, again, Elena's saying, as part of the secular Jewish practice or tradition. Personal identification and commitment to engage. Yeah. Can you say more about that, Beth? I'm not sure I understand what you mean. Malky saying that Heather's experience as an outsider within the Jewish community is striking. Yeah, so right here she talks about wanting to be a rabbi, and she was told that she wasn't. And actually, many women who were activists in the civil rights movement went on to work for gender equity and gender parity within Judaism and the Jewish world. And we have some lessons on that also. Right, social justice started in their families, whether they knew it was Jewish value or not. And that's something that's definitely a trope. If you look through the oral histories and resources on our site, that you see over and over again, that it wasn't necessarily, not all civil rights volunteers went and said, like, I am Jewish and I believe in social justice, so I'm going south. But a lot of them say it was part of our family tradition because we were Jewish, and therefore we didn't have a choice. We had to take action. Great. All of these are awesome. Absolutely. And also, this is interesting, Beth, that you raised this, a commitment from a young age to take a stand against wrongs. So something about having that modeled for you and your family, and also having that be an expectation, which also caused some conflict. We'll talk about this at the end, but also caused some conflict between parents who were worried about their children's safety and children who felt like their parents had raised them to go and do this, and whether or not they were allowed to go south and whether or not they were being supported in that. Great. So we're going to move on to the next activity. So these are, Jewish moms. Yeah, so these are the questions. I think that this third question here is especially important. So we always, thinking about those two arrows that we talked about at the beginning, we always want to create entry points for our students here, for them to think about their own identity. So thinking about, here are some stories that you heard and about these people's experiences. What in your life has been similar to that or different from that? But just finding a place for students to sort of bring themselves into the conversation. Great. Okay, so the next thing that we're going to do is, because all of our education work is based on using primary source documents, we spend a lot of time doing sort of text study of either texts or photographs or audio clips and music. So what we're going to do now is we're going to do one of those text studies, and I'm going to break you all into two groups. So I'll go with one group and Miriam will go with one group into virtual rooms, and we'll have two breakout groups. So in your breakout room, you're going to find a document. Take 2 minutes or so to read that document on your own. And then together as a group, you'll discuss these two questions. Which reasons were given, which of the given reasons, rather, were most resonant to you, and that which sound like what would make you decide to go be active in Freedom Summer and to go as a volunteer. So again, this is a place where now students have learned a little bit about the history, they've learned a little bit about what it was like, why other people went, and now they're getting a chance to say, here are some reasons, which ones work for me and which ones don't. So I'm going to break us into rooms now, and I will see you all in about 12 minutes or so. There is one point that I wanted to bring up that came out of our conversation, which is we talked a lot about how younger students perhaps feel more distant from being identified as other or feeling marginalized or things like that. And that one of the challenges for helping them understand why people chose to participate in this work is because of that. And I just wanted to let you all know that we're going to be having next Tuesday evening, so in 5 days or so, an evening conversation that's an open discussion talking about teens and Jewish identity and how we help students explore who they are through a Jewish lens. So I'll be sure to send you all that information, and if any of you are interested in hopping into that conversation, it's going to be in this format, but I won't be presenting. It'll just be a conversation of ideas. So I'll make sure I send that to you all, because some of those questions started to come up in our breakout group. Great, so moving right along, the third station in the lesson plan is about community and community organizing, and it uses sort of 3 different tools to get to these points. One of the first tools, and I'm only going to show you one of them because the other ones are kind of hard to do right now. So the first one is a game, and the point of the game is to play some sort of game where all of the students have different abilities and have to work towards a task together. And we have 2 examples of how to do that in the lesson plan, one that's better for big groups and one that's better for small groups. And And then after they do the game as sort of a simulation, they discuss these questions. So could you have accomplished your goal if you weren't working together? What challenges were there? And then just thinking about the process of working together as a group and using that to sort of map onto how community organizing happened, and sort of how these communal efforts happened. The second piece is a photo study about this photo, and talking a little bit about the role that music played in the civil rights movement. I'm not going to focus on this today because in January we're going to be having another online learning program that's a whole session just about music in the civil rights movement and in Judaism. So if you're interested in learning more about this aspect of it, come back for that program in January. There's going to be singing. And also, if you want to teach this, all of the resources are in the lesson plan. So it should be really easy for you to sort of do it on your own. I do want to just share a short clip of an oral history with you. And this oral history is from, again, from Vicki Gabriner. So here's a picture of her. So we're going to just listen to this clip of her speaking about her experience as a volunteer. And she talks a little bit about music at a church, a mass meeting at a church. So we're going to just listen to that and just an excerpt of it, and then we're going to talk about it a little bit more. And here's the transcript.
And I don't think I'm romanticizing it as I look back on it. I mean, I remember that, there were just the most extraordinary moments in that work. I remember times, being at a mass meeting inside a church and singing We Shall Overcome, and knowing that there were white people outside, in their cars, in their trucks, probably with guns, and feeling as though, the roof was just going to lift off the church, because the energy, the people with whom we were working was so intense. It was so, the struggle, they were so involved in the struggle that it was palpable. I mean, it was palpable. I think that the things that were...
Okay. So using the transcript and the audio clip, and I like to sort of offer both because some people prefer to listen and some people prefer to read along. And then we're not going to talk about all of these questions, but I want to mostly talk about the first one, which sort of starts to get at different communities. So Vicki talks about a community in the church and a community outside the church. So thinking about those two groups, which is the community that you think Vicki most identifies with? And then also, what does she have in common with each of those two groups? I'll throw that question out to you all. Yeah, okay. So the question is, which group does she identify with more? And what does she have in common with each of the groups? So there's this group of white and Black civil rights workers inside the church, and then a group of white people outside of the church. Yeah, so Rachel's saying racially outside, idealistically inside. It's also interesting to think about as a Jew, she's having this experience in a church with a lot of Christian people. So thinking about that as a context, and the church became very much a community center for all activists in the South. And it was not always easy for Jews to find their place there, and also I think frequently surprising for them. So Alach was saying, I think it's interesting. I lost it. I think it's interesting that she described the people outside as the white people. She obviously feels separate from them. Yeah. Yeah, so something about sharing a struggle. You all are also writing in about how powerful the church community was. So this, I think, I don't want to spend too much time on it. It is like a little, I think it's really direct, but it gives students a concrete example for looking at the similarities and differences between white activists and Jewish white activists and the community that they were working with, and the community that was actively working against them, and sort of thinking about that. And something that this lesson touches on, that's touched on more in other lessons, is the complicated nature of Jewish involvement in the civil rights movement because Jews are racially considered white. And that's, there's increasing racial diversity in the American Jewish community, and there's always been diversity globally within the Jewish community, but that white-black difference really comes out in the civil rights movement and is especially complicated because of what we talked about before, that Jews carry with them the experience of other and the experience of the immigrant, but when they were white in the South, they had the power of white people in the South, and that is complicated. So this is to sort of start poking at some of that conversation and those thoughts. And there's more resources in Living the Legacy if that particular conversation is something that you want to carry forward with your students. So at the end, So at the end of the lesson, what we ask students to do is sort of revisit these questions. Are you going to come to Mississippi? If you are, why or why not? What's motivating you to be there? And which area in freedom schools, in building the Mississippi Freedom Democratic Party, or working for voter registration would you be most interested in doing? And that's where sort of the official part of the lesson concludes, but we have an extension of the lesson that is actually one of my most favorite things in our entire curriculum. So I want us to take the last 10 minutes or so that we're here to take a look at that. So this section is called Voices of Freedom Summer, and this, if students have the historical background, could be its whole lesson in and of itself. So like I said before, there's a lot of content here, and I leave it to you to figure out how to package this for your students since you know them best. And if you need help doing that, you can reach out to me, to Miriam, or to the other people in our educator community and sort of we can help you strategize how to do that. So what we're going to do now is we have in the lesson plan about 5 letters, but in this I just picked one so that we can all read it together. And what you're going to do is you're going to take a minute and read the letter. And then what I'd like you to do is I'm posting a link to an online tool called the Lino board in the chat, which is just a sticky note page. And so what I want you to do is read the letter. I'm going to pull it up and then write a response to the letter as if you are the person that Sylvie is writing to. So here's the letter. And Sylvie is writing a letter that starts, "Dear Dad." So take a minute, read this, and then post a response to the letter as if you were her dad writing back, what you would say given what you know and what she brings up in the letter. And I'm going to stop talking unless people have questions. They can post questions in the chat and sort of let you work. And then we'll get a chance to sort of just read each other's letters. Yes, so just a few questions responding as her dad. So yes, respond as her dad, writing a letter back to her. as she's about to embark on her journey to Freedom Summer. It doesn't have to be long or elaborate. It could just be a few sentences or even a bulleted outline, just to get you sort of thinking about it. Let me know if you have other questions. When you do it, choose the small font. Just one? Yeah, so that they all fit. Great, so we've got a couple letters coming up here. Once you've posted yours, you can hit the refresh button, and it'll allow you to see other stickies that have been posted. What's yours? Oh, there we go. Oh, we got it. Great. I'm going to give you all, these are great, so I'm just reading them. I'll give you all 1 or 2 more minutes before I start talking about what you've posted. Great. So please keep writing. I just want to make a couple observations about these. And so you can do this in a couple different ways. You could have, in the activity, we suggest that one way you could do it is have your students write the response. They pass that letter to someone else. They write back again as Sylvie. So that's one way to do it. You can have people post their responses, as we've done here, up around the room, and then allow others to comment on them. But I do want to make a couple observations based on what you all have posted. So a lot of people are being supportive of the work, and there certainly are parents who did that. And actually some of the letters mention specifically, you know, thank you for supporting me, or there's a letter that Heather Booth wrote to her brother saying, don't tell mom and dad that I'm writing you this because they'll be scared. So it's interesting to think about the generational dynamics there. This could also be a really great lesson just to do this activity with a mixed generational group, especially with parents and students. So it could be really interesting to sort of bring them together in discussion about activism, and then maybe turn that into activism in their own lives and communities now. I think a lot of people are also, like, putting in your letters, you put some trust in Sylvie to make decisions for herself, acknowledging that whatever white workers and the experience of white volunteers was, that the experience of Black or African American people in Mississippi was worse and tenfold in some ways, and also like much larger. So thinking about that and putting it in perspective there racially. Reading the yeah, and I also want to respond to the observation that you said, Elena, about knowing about her dad. It is hard to know. We don't have a lot of information about these people because the letters come from a collection of letters. So we don't know a lot about the people who wrote them. But I think that ambiguity actually lends itself quite nicely to capturing a bunch of different perspectives. So we also have the letter in our collection here that says, "Dear Sylvie, come home, love Dad." And that's certainly how some parents felt in this process. So we have we're sort of at the end of our session now, but I do, before we wrap up here, just want to invite you all, if you have questions or insights that you want to share with the group, I just want to give you a minute to do that before I give my concluding spiel. So a few people are typing in, so I'll just give you a moment. Great. So Kate saying, I was thinking that these might be good lessons to incorporate for February Black History Month, definitely during Pesach. Absolutely. We have so a Pesach specific lesson in this collection also, which I will put the link in the chat box for it for Living Legacy. Can you put the Living Legacy link in there so that you all have it? I also put the link for this lesson plan in the web links pod, which I just launched. Also that note that 2014, so this new year, is the 50th anniversary of Freedom Summer. So this is a particularly timely time to be sharing this story. So I just want to conclude by saying thank you so much for coming today, and I really look forward to hearing from you all about how you're able to use this material and other material from us in your classes. In the web links pod, there are 3 different links, one for a feedback survey, one to the lesson plan for this, and one to the JWA National Educators Network. So the feedback survey is pretty straightforward. If you could just take a minute or two to give us some feedback on this program, we would really appreciate it. We also have a Facebook group called the National Educators Network. And if you click on that link, you can request to join. We will approve you before we do anything else after this meeting. And that's a really great place to say, hey, I want to teach X, Y, and Z things. Does anyone have ideas? Or to say, I just put together my own program using some of the materials from JWA and some stuff I found in other places. Here you go, and you can share it. So please join the group. It's a great way to stay connected with other teachers who are using this material. Again, we will send you all of the information about the recording, resources that you need to teach this lesson, and places to find even more resources about Freedom Summer and civil rights activism on Monday. So thanks again for coming, and hopefully, one other thing that I should say is that I mentioned before, we're having our meetup program on Tuesday at 7:30 next week, so I'll be sure to give you the information. You can also find it on our website here. Meetups. Yeah, that's right. And we will be holding one more online learning program this year, also about social justice activism. That's going to happen in 2013, and then we'll start more programs in January. So next week, same time, same place, we're going to have an online learning program about collective activism and Jewish involvement in the labor movement. So if any of you are interested in coming to that, we would love to have you. With no further ado, thank you for the time that you've given us today. Have a wonderful rest of the afternoon, and please be in touch if you have any questions.